The City of Cape Town's preliminary report identified that Parliament was not compliant with fire regulations, including having unserviced fire equipment. And although no official assessment has been done, some have estimated that the damage could cost almost R1 billion, with media reports suggesting that the Parliament building was not insured. Now, this raises questions about the administration of the state and whether this could be a case across various government-owned buildings across the country. And joining us now to unpack this somewhat further is Professor Kwandiwe Kondlo, and he's a professor of international political economy in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. Professor, good morning. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, Sakina.
So, Prof, as a researcher with an interest in the subject of governance and public administration, I have to ask, what were your thoughts and what came to mind when you read that Parliament, or at least the section of the building that burned down, might not be fully insured?
Sakina, it was really very surprising because many of us, I'm sure many South Africans assume that buildings like our Parliament, National Assembly, are actually insured in one way or the other. So it was really surprising to hear that the building is not insured at all. But at the same time, you get to ask other questions. Questions related to the failure to do the right things when employed in positions such as being the official in the National Assembly, the administrator in the National Assembly. Why are people not doing the right things which citizens expect them to do, which are also in terms of the law? Compliance is a very important thing. It's not just a matter of ticking the box. It's important to do things. If they require detail, do them in detail, but do the right things the way they are supposed to be done. You ask yourself whether this is happening across all sectors of government. Because without this happening, really, we're still going to experience many crises in various departments all over the country. So the incidents of fire in the National Assembly and Parliament got us to raise many, many questions. Other questions on a broader scale are about democratization and state institutional capacity. Does democratization blunt the effectiveness of state institutions? Or is the relationship between democratization and state institutional performance a relation with a negative correlation? So you ask all these questions as you watch things unfolding in South Africa.
Indeed, Professor Kondlo. And of course, then, the question that you ask as the basis for all of this is, of course, why people who are employed to ensure that these things happen have not done so. But I suppose more broadly, what happened to the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to kick in? Because then it raises a few other questions at the core of this matter, like, for example, Professor, whether South Africa as a state is actually capable of running its own administration, its own affairs or not. And would you say, Prof, that this is reflective of the current state of things in the country?
Sakina, I'm tempted to generalize and say this is reflective of the current state of things in the country. And the reason why I'm accepting that generalization is because of the character of underlying politics You see, the character of underlying politics affects everything. It affects the economy, it affects society, it affects popular culture, it affects governance in state institutions. You see, the character of underlying politics in South Africa is so bad. It really needs strong leadership, serious negotiations to turn things around. I can even refer you, for instance, quite recently, a warning from the IMF given to South Africa. I think it was around the 9th of December, 2021, you see, where the IMF underlines the same point we are discussing. It says there's a need for strong and decisive leadership to deal with inefficiencies at the level of governance and the issue of corruption. That's from the IMF, to say if South Africa is to overcome the challenges it has, there's a need for strong leadership to deal decisively with inefficiencies at the level of governance and also deal with corruption. This actually shows that that's how we are perceived as a country by outsiders. Yeah? And it's important that we don't dismiss these perceptions and start being defensive. It's important that we deal with these issues. People who are put in positions of supervision, they must supervise. People who are given a task to service, let me say in institutions like Parliament, infrastructure details. If we are given that task to deal with the details of infrastructure that requires service, please do it, and do it according to the book. Don't cut corners simply because you want to quickly go and tick the box. Don't cut corners because you know you have a trade union that is going to stand up for you and you can't be fired easily. These are the issues that we need to confront directly, face to face. Otherwise, our country is going to be in serious trouble.
And, you know, at the moment, it seems as though we are exactly there, Professor Kondlo, as evidenced by a wide array of things that are happening at the moment. But do you get the sense, Professor, that there may be a necessary and keen understanding by those running a government, those running the state, that these matters are actually at the core of good governance and fiduciary duty to have custodial responsibility over the nation's assets?
I think, Sakina, there is understanding that these issues are at the core of good governance. But what is important is, what do you do with that kind of understanding? When you have that kind of understanding, what do you do? Do you sit on your job and just argue that I will do the little I can? Do you sit on your job and say, look, I'm going to just try finish the assignment for the sake of finishing it? You see, this issue also has to do with the conscience that you find amongst our people who occupy, more especially those who occupy serious positions in government and in state institutions. The conscience that you find amongst these people. You see, the issue of politics and conscience is just another issue which needs to be reignited and studied and understood very carefully. Because otherwise, with an I don't care attitude, look, we're really going to face more and more decay in our politics, more and more destruction in our institutions. So it's important really that even the ruling party which deploys cadres, the ANC needs to understand what a cadre is. when you talk about a cadre, you're talking about a very special breed amongst your people. You're talking about people who can lead in terms of making huge sacrifices. You're talking about people who are trained or people who can quickly acquire a new skill and perform and excel. That is a cadre. It's not a person who's deployed just for reasons of political convenience and political advantage. That kind of cadreship and that kind of deployment, that's what is destroying South Africa today. Because such cadres are people who just after personal gain and after power. Such type of cadreship is not really helping us to build a strong economy recognized and respected by the world. It's not that I'm pessimistic, but we have to be very realistic. Let's stop patting ourselves in the back and say all these are problems of a democracy which is consolidating. That is not acceptable at all, such explanations. We need to deal with the challenges we confront. We have serious challenges confronting our country, and many of us, and especially guys in government, we have to stand up. We have to lead by example.
Now, Professor, if we look at that consciousness and the understanding that you touched on earlier on, and if we assume that everybody knows and understands the importance of good corporate governance, then it should be common cause that a capable state should therefore foreground efficiency and governance as its very reason for its existence. So if we look at what's been happening, if we track the administrative malfunctions that we've seen, who ultimately then should take responsibility for what is happening?
Administrative malfunctions are so broad and varied, Sakina. But I also agree with the point you are making that, look, there are people who have to take responsibility. And on the overall, management takes responsibility. Management takes responsibility. And it's something we need to look into. And just ask the question, how do we make sure that management takes responsibility in a more meaningful way? In other words, lessons which have occurred in one institution of government should actually spread across. And out of such lessons, standards have to be generated, or existing standards have to be revised. In other words, management should take responsibility, and that responsibility should come with shared sets of lessons that can be distributed across government institutions. Look, it's time really that, I repeat, we stop patting ourselves on the back. Because if you look at the country, just across sectors, there's a lot which is going wrong. You look at society which is the context within which government operates. Things are not good. In fact, I once said there is an impending social collapse which is facing South Africa. And once a state of social collapse occurs, it's going to be mayhem right across the board, right across South Africa. Because at that point, you find people prepared to do anything for just a few rands. In other words, you can buy people to to do the worst thing you can imagine for a mega 1,000 rands, because people are so desperate. With social collapse, you see the growth in numbers of communities of despair. Hope gets totally destroyed. And we don't want to see that in South Africa.
So where and how do we start to arrest this, Professor Kondlo? Because if you take, for example, the Western Cape, which is where the seat of Parliament is, you would have seen, for example, the public building shacks right on the railway tracks, and many other such acts of impunity abound. You have railway stations across the country stripped to the bone. How should ordinary people be expected to respect the state assets if officials who are entrusted to take care of these public resources on behalf of the citizens are dropping the ball themselves?
Sakina, that is very, very important, the point you are raising. But it talks to one issue where I think we're still weak as a country. We are weak when it comes to public education, community education. I think we're still weak on that, and it's one area where various South Africans need to start concentrating their NGO efforts on. We need to focus on the sphere of community education. We need to I don't want to use to say empower, but we need to educate our communities on the ground such that on their own, these communities can hold leaders to account, leaders at ward level, you see. In other words, before people go to the streets to participate, they need to actually understand the spaces of participation provided in terms of legislation. They need to understand what they can do first to engage public leadership. And I think from there, we will be able to find directions to get our communities more involved, to get society to hold political leadership to account. I think that particular one, we call it public participation, but it's just a buzzword. If you look at various state institutions, they have failed when it comes to institution of effective public participation. We need to really mainstream public participation in government departments, in provincial departments, in municipalities. Get our communities more engaged. We need to have a seriously dialogic democracy if we are to save our situation in this country. And of course, I don't want not to underline the importance of providing in government leaders who understand, leaders who can bear the burden of ethical example. And these leaders don't have to always come from the African National Congress. There are many people who are not members of the ANC. There are many South Africans, good, great South Africans, who were never members of the ANC, but who can deliver, if given a chance in government, deliver to the better, to the betterment of society as a whole.
Professor, thank you so much for your time this morning and those reflections. Professor Kwandiwe Kondlo, the Professor of International Political Economy in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg, and discussing with us their governance in the administration of state assets.